History isn't a gentle current, it's a raging river, and its course is often changed by a single, immovable rock. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire was an unstoppable flood, a superpower that had swallowed kingdoms from Persia to the Balkans. By the late 17th century, its shadow fell long and deep over Europe. Its armies were the stuff of legend. And in 1683, this seemingly invincible force set its sights on the one prize that had slipped through its fingers for over a century, the city that stood as the gateway to the heart of Europe, Vienna. In 1683, the Ottoman Empire was at the absolute peak of its strength. Its armies had conquered vast territories and now stood at the very gates of Vienna. An enormous army, with some contemporary sources claiming as many as 170,000 soldiers, was poised to shatter the city's defenses. For 2 long, brutal months, a tiny garrison of defenders held out against overwhelming odds, their hope dwindling with each sunrise. So how did this unstoppable force, on the very brink of its greatest triumph, suffer a defeat so catastrophic that it would halt its expansion for good? This is the story of the Siege of Vienna, the desperate defense, the clashing of civilizations, and the legendary charge that changed the course of history forever. To understand the cataclysm of 1683, you have to understand the man who willed it into being. It wasn't the Sultan himself, Mehmed IV. He was more interested in hunting than in running an empire. The real power was his Grand Vizier, the formidable and ferociously ambitious Mirzafonlu Kara Mustafa Pasha. Kara Mustafa was a product of an era of renewed Ottoman vigor, and he possessed incredible administrative skill, but that skill was paired with a dangerous, all-consuming personal ambition. Outwardly, he was a dignified and pious leader. Inwardly, though, a deep-seated arrogance burned. He wanted to etch his name into history, to surpass even the legendary Suleiman the Magnificent. A century and a half earlier, in 1529, Suleiman himself had led an army to Vienna, only to be turned back. For Kara Mustafa, capturing the city was more than a strategic goal. It was an obsession. He dreamed of delivering the Golden Apple, as the Ottomans called it, to his sultan and securing his own legacy as one of the greatest conquerors in the empire's history. The political landscape of Europe seemed to be conspiring in his favor. The Habsburg Empire, ruled by Emperor Leopold I, was far from stable. It was weakened by internal conflicts, especially in Hungary, where Protestant nobles were chafing under Catholic rule. A charismatic Hungarian leader, Imre Thököly, led a rebellion and openly appealed to the Ottomans for help. Kara Mustafa saw this not as a plea for aid, but as a golden opportunity. He made Thököly a vassal prince and used the alliance as the perfect pretext for a massive military intervention. Meanwhile, the rest of Europe was a mess of competing interests. The continent's other great power, France under King Louis XIV, was a bitter rival of the Habsburgs. French diplomats actively worked to prevent any anti-Ottoman alliance, figuring a threat to Vienna was a great way to weaken their main enemy. Pope Innocent XI saw the existential threat and pleaded for a united Christian front, but his calls were mostly met with political maneuvering and indifference. And so, the decision was made. Kara Mustafa, going far beyond the Sultan's more modest goals, began to assemble a colossal war machine. The plan wasn't just to punish the Habsburgs, it was to strike at the heart of his enemy, take Vienna, and use it as a launching pad for further conquests. He believed victory wasn't just possible, but preordained. This was to be his holy war, his path to immortal glory. He just failed to account for 2 things: the resilience of the city he planned to conquer and the forces its desperation would ultimately awaken. On March 31, 1683, a formal declaration of war arrived at the imperial court in Vienna. The very next day, the Ottoman army began its march. It was the start of a logistical feat that was as impressive as it was terrifying, as a river of soldiers, animals, and equipment flowed north through the Balkans. The army Kara Mustafa assembled was one of the largest of the era. While historians debate the precise numbers, modern estimates place his force somewhere between 120,000 and 150,000 men. At its core were the Janissaries, the elite infantry of the Sultan. They were the shock troops, the feared backbone of the Ottoman military. Supporting them were the Sipahis, the elite household cavalry. But the army was much more than that. There were artillerymen, armorers, and vast numbers of provincial troops. Crucially, there were the Lagemchiller, the skilled miners whose job it would be to dig beneath Vienna's walls and blast them into rubble. Joining them were thousands of light cavalry from the Crimean Khanate, masters of the raid. It was a force designed not just for battle, but for a siege. As this great army advanced, it left a trail of destruction. On July 11th, the town of Perch-Tolsdorf, just south of Vienna, surrendered after being offered terms, only for its citizens to be massacred anyway. News of the slaughter spread like wildfire, a deliberate act of terror designed to break the capital's will. Panic gripped Vienna. The Emperor, Leopold I, along with his court and about 60,000 wealthy residents, fled the city. Their flight was a devastating blow to morale, leaving the remaining citizens feeling abandoned. Yet, in his overconfidence, Kara Mustafa made a few critical mistakes. Believing Vienna would fall quickly, he made the fateful choice to leave his heaviest siege cannons behind. The journey through the Balkans was tough, and the massive guns would have slowed him down. He gambled that they wouldn't be needed. He also coveted the city's wealth and wanted to possess it intact, not reduce it to a pile of rubble, a decision that would shape his entire strategy. On July 14, 1683, the ordeal began. The main Ottoman army arrived, and an endless sea of tents spread out around Vienna's walls, cutting it off from the world. Kara Mustafa set up his magnificent headquarters and sent the traditional demand for surrender. The answer he received would set the stage for 2 months of unrelenting horror. Inside Vienna, the man who received Kara Mustafa's demand was Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, the city's military governor. He was a seasoned soldier, but he was facing an almost unimaginable challenge. His garrison had just 11,000 regular soldiers and around 5,000 citizen volunteers. He was vastly outnumbered, facing an army perhaps 8 times the size of his own. Starhemberg's response was defiant. "Let him come. I'll fight to the last drop of blood." It was a promise he intended to keep. He knew his only hope was to hold out long enough for a relief army to arrive, an army that, at that moment, didn't even exist. The siege began on July 17th. The Ottomans, being masters of siege warfare, didn't try a suicidal frontal assault. Instead, they began to dig. A vast network of trenches snaked its way toward the city walls, protecting the soldiers as they crept closer. From the ramparts, the Viennese watched as the very earth seemed to crawl toward them. The real threat, however, was underground. The Ottoman sappers began to drive tunnels, or mines, toward the foundations of the city's bastions. Their goal was simple: pack the tunnels with gunpowder, detonate them, and create massive breaches for the Janissaries to storm. What followed was a grim, subterranean war. The Viennese dug their own countermines, listening for the telltale sounds of Ottoman digging. When tunnels met, savage battles were fought with picks and shovels in near-total darkness. Starhemberg's men got good at finding and destroying the Ottoman mines, but they couldn't find them all. Throughout August, thunderous explosions rocked the city as key bastions were systematically shattered. Life inside the city became a nightmare. The constant bombardment turned streets into death traps. Food supplies vanished. People were reduced to eating cats and rats. Worse than the hunger was the disease. Dysentery, the Red Death, ran rampant, claiming far more lives than the Turkish cannons. Starhemberg was everywhere, a whirlwind of desperate energy. He barely slept, moving from one crisis to another, rallying his exhausted men. He was even wounded himself, but refused to give up command. His leadership was inspiring, but he was fighting a losing battle against time. By early September, the garrison had been bled white. Only about a third of the soldiers were still fit for duty. The walls were no longer a barrier, but a series of gaping, smoking breaches. Vienna was on the verge of collapse. From the high spire of St. Stephen's Cathedral, lookouts scanned the hills to the northwest, praying for a miracle. While Vienna starved, the slow wheels of 17th century diplomacy were finally beginning to turn. News of the siege had sent a shockwave across the Christian world. The political rivalries that had paralyzed the continent began to seem pretty small in the face of this threat. The main catalyst for action was Pope Innocent XI. He worked tirelessly, using his moral authority and his money to forge an alliance. The core of any relief force had to be the armies of the Holy Roman Empire. Emperor Leopold I had promised support, and various German princes began to mobilize their troops under the command of Charles of Lorraine. He was a capable commander, but his forces alone weren't enough. They needed more men and a leader who knew how to defeat the Ottomans. All eyes turned to Poland. Its king, John III Sobieski, was initially reluctant. Poland had a complicated history with the Habsburgs and was wary of getting dragged into their wars. But Sobieski was also a devout Catholic and a brilliant warrior who had earned the nickname the Lion of Lekistan from the Turks themselves. The Pope's diplomacy proved decisive. He sent a massive subsidy to Poland to help fund the expedition. More importantly, Sobieski decided to honor the Treaty of Warsaw, a defensive pact he had signed with Leopold earlier that year. The treaty was simple. If either Vienna or Krakow were besieged, the other would come to their aid with all their might. On August 15, 1683, Sobieski marched from Krakow with about 27,000 Polish soldiers, including his most feared troops, the winged Hussars. As his army moved south, it linked up with the forces of the Holy Roman Empire. By early September, a combined relief army of around 70,000 men had been assembled, a remarkable if temporary display of European unity. Command of this diverse army was given to the man with the highest rank and the most experience fighting the Turks, King John III Sobieski. The plan they came up with was bold. Instead of approaching from the east, they would march through the dense Vienna woods to the northwest of the city. Their goal was to emerge onto the Kahlenberg Heights, hills that overlooked the entire Ottoman camp. Kara Mustafa knew a relief army was coming, but his arrogance blinded him to the real danger. He held his European counterparts in contempt and failed to properly scout the Vienna woods, keeping most of his army focused on taking the city. He was convinced Vienna would fall before any relief force could become a real threat. It was a colossal miscalculation, and it would seal his fate. The march through the Vienna woods was an immense struggle. For days, the soldiers of the Holy League toiled, hacking their way through thick forest and dragging heavy cannons up muddy slopes. They knew that every hour mattered. On September 11th, with the walls about to collapse, Starhemberg ordered a final desperate signal rocket fired into the night sky. A plea for help to an army they could only pray was there. Their prayer was about to be answered. That same day, the relief army finally emerged from the woods and secured the Kahlenberg Heights. As dawn broke on September 12, 1683, the leaders of the Christian army stood on the hilltop and looked down. The sight was breathtaking. Spread out below them for miles was the Ottoman camp, a sprawling city of tents housing an army that still significantly outnumbered their own. Beyond the camp lay the battered, smoking city of Vienna, its fate hanging by a thread. The Ottoman command was thrown into chaos. They had been caught almost completely by surprise. Kara Mustafa now faced a terrible choice: continue the final assault on the city, which was moments from falling, or turn his army around to face the new threat. He tried to do both, and in doing so, did neither effectively. In a last-ditch effort, his sappers tried to detonate their final mines under the city walls, but they were found and disarmed by the defenders just in time. For the soldiers of the Holy League, the moment of truth had arrived. The plan was to attack at dawn. The German forces under Charles of Lorraine would form the left wing and center, grinding down the main body of the Ottoman army. The Polish forces, including the elite winged Hussars, would be held in reserve on the right, waiting for the decisive moment. A Catholic Mass was held for the troops. A Capuchin friar named Marco da Viano, who had been sent by the Pope, absolved the soldiers of their sins and prepared them for the fight. As the sun climbed higher, the banners of the Holy Roman Empire, of Saxony, Bavaria, and Poland were unfurled. The greatest battle of the age was about to begin. The battle began at 4 o'clock in the morning on September 12th. Charles of Lorraine ordered his imperial army forward, and a brutal, grinding fight began for control of the fortified villages on the slopes. For hours, it was a bloody slugfest. The imperial forces would push forward, get thrown back by fierce Ottoman counterattacks, and push forward again. Kara Mustafa threw more and more of his troops into the fight, desperately trying to hold them back. By midday, Charles's men had inflicted heavy casualties and were close to a breakthrough, pinning down a huge portion of the Ottoman army. Meanwhile, on the right flank, John III Sobieski watched with a veteran's patience. He held his cavalry back, waiting for the perfect moment. He needed the Ottoman army to be fully committed, exhausted, and demoralized. As the afternoon wore on, that moment arrived. The Allied infantry had pushed the Ottomans off the high ground and onto the plains before their camp. The Ottoman soldiers were tired and dispirited. They'd been fighting for 12 hours after 2 months of a grueling siege. At around 4 in the afternoon, Sobieski gave the order. It was time. An immense force of approximately 18,000 horsemen began to descend the hills. It was one of the largest cavalry charges in history. King John III, Sobieski placed himself at the front, leading 3,000 of his elite winged Hussars. These were the pinnacle of heavy cavalry, famous for the massive feathered wings worn on their backs. The sight and sound of them was designed to be terrifying. As 18,000 horses began to move as one, eyewitnesses said it sounded like a thunderbolt, an earthquake, an avalanche of men and steel. They started at a walk, then a trot, and as they hit the open plain, the pace quickened to a full earth-shattering gallop. They lowered their lances and smashed into the wavering Ottoman lines like a tidal wave. The impact was apocalyptic. The long Polish lances shattered, throwing the Ottoman ranks into chaos. The sheer shock of the charge, the sight of these winged riders, broke the morale of the exhausted Ottoman troops. Formations that had held firm all day simply disintegrated. The Hussars punched a massive hole straight through the Ottoman center, heading directly for Kara Mustafa's headquarters. Seeing the main line break, the Viennese garrison, starved but filled with adrenaline, sallied out from the city's gates and attacked the Ottomans from the rear. Trapped between the hammer of the cavalry and the anvil of the city, the Ottoman army completely collapsed. Panic turned into a rout. Less than 3 hours after the charge began, the battle was over. The Ottoman army, which had been on the verge of victory that morning, had been utterly destroyed. Kara Mustafa barely escaped with his life, leaving behind his entire camp, his treasury, and the sacred standard of the Prophet. The Siege of Vienna was broken. As the sun set on September 12th, the fields before Vienna presented a scene of unbelievable contrast. The vast, luxurious Ottoman camp was abandoned, filled with unimaginable riches, jewels, silks, and the Grand Vizier's personal treasury. It took the victorious troops a week to gather all the loot. Popular legend says that among the abandoned supplies were sacks of strange beans, which the Viennese learned to roast and brew, introducing coffee to the city. Another famous story claims a baker created a crescent-shaped pastry, the croissant, to celebrate. While these stories are almost certainly myths, they show just how profound this moment was. But the spoils couldn't mask the horrific cost. The battlefield was a landscape of death. The Ottomans suffered devastating losses, with tens of thousands of casualties in the battle and the retreat that followed. The coalition army had also paid a heavy price, losing around 4,500 men. For the Ottoman Empire, the defeat was a disaster. The invincible aura of its army was shattered. For Kara Mustafa, there would be no recovery. His ambition had led his army to ruin, and the price for such a failure was absolute. While trying to rally his broken forces in Belgrade, the order for his own execution arrived from the Sultan. On Christmas Day, 1683, Kara Mustafa, the man who dreamed of conquering Europe, was strangled with a silk cord. His head was cut off and presented to the Sultan in a velvet bag. The victory at Vienna had immediate and far-reaching consequences. It spurred the European powers into action. In 1684, at the urging of Pope Innocent XI, a new Holy League was formed. This alliance wasn't just defensive. Its goal was to go on the offensive and roll back centuries of Ottoman conquest. The Battle of Vienna marked the beginning of the Great Turkish War, a conflict that lasted another 16 years. The momentum had decisively shifted. The forces of the Holy League drove the Ottomans out of Hungary and much of the Balkans. The war ended with the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, which forced the Ottoman Empire to give up huge territories in Europe. It was a turning point from which the empire would never fully recover. The Ottoman tide, which had been rising for 300 years, had finally begun to recede. The Siege of Vienna was more than just a battle. It was a moment that redrew the map of Europe and defined the balance of power for centuries. The story of the desperate defenders, the ambitious vizier, and the thunderous charge of the winged Hussars is a powerful testament to how history can turn on a single day. If you found this story compelling, please consider supporting our channel, Ancient Vault. Like this video and subscribe for more stories about the epic battles and crucial turning points that have shaped our world. And let us know in the comments, what other historical event do you think changed everything? We read all your suggestions. The victory at Vienna secured the Habsburg dynasty's dominance in Central Europe, laying the foundations for the future Austro-Hungarian Empire. For Poland, the victory was the nation's finest hour, a moment of incredible glory, though it would sadly be one of the last great triumphs for the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth before its own decline. The battle marked the definitive end of the Ottoman Empire's expansion into Europe. Never again would a Turkish army threaten the heart of the continent. The defeat triggered a long period of stagnation within the empire as it struggled to adapt to the rising power of its European rivals. Today, the Siege of Vienna stands as a powerful symbol. It's remembered as a clash of civilizations, a story of desperate courage against overwhelming odds, and a turning point in the long, complex relationship between Europe and the Ottoman world. It's a reminder that empires can be stopped, that tides can be turned, and that sometimes the fate of a continent can be decided by a few defenders on a city wall, and the thunderous arrival of hope from over the hills.